and welcome to Starbucks Story of a Turnaround. My name is Jack Koenig, and I will be discussing history and the initial strategy of the company. Then Jason Artwell will cover market conditions. Fred Paul will discuss the new strategy. Daniel Scoggins will give us an analysis of that new strategy. And finally, Josh Holm will discuss the results of the new strategy. So, Starbucks actually started over 40 years ago as a seller of coffee beans. They roasted the beans themselves. They did what was called dark roasting, which was a new thing to the United States at the time. It wasn't common because most people used cheaper beans that couldn't hold up to the dark roasting. So Starbucks focused on Arabica coffee beans, and those were able to be dark roasted, which made a more flavorful bean. And they didn't serve any beverages. They weren't interested in having restaurants. They didn't want to serve beverages. They just wanted to roast and sell beans to people to make coffee at home. So in the 1980s, America didn't know the difference between these high-quality Arabica beans and the cheaper beans. They had never heard of espresso or cafe latte. They had never tried one. You know, maybe a few people who had been to Europe had, but your typical American never heard of such a thing. And nobody was going to pay $4 for a coffee drink or even just $2 for a plain cup of coffee. That was absurd. So now in the 1980s, a man named Howard Schultz developed a blue ocean strategy in the U.S. around these higher quality coffee drinks. So the story of Starbucks as the company as we know it is really the story of their CEO, Howard Schultz. He became an employee of the original owners back in the 80s, and then he took a trip to Italy, and he was at a trade show in Milan, and as he was walking from his hotel to the show, he came across these espresso bars, and he just loved the atmosphere. He loved the baristas and the way they interacted with the customers, and then of course the espresso was just an amazing flavor, and he just loved the coffee. Well, he came back and told the owners of Starbucks all about this. They still weren't interested. They had zero interest in owning restaurants. They just wanted to sell beans. So he actually had to leave the company with their support and started his own company called Il Giornale and had these Il Giornale espresso bars around Seattle, and then he started to branch out into other cities. Well, in order to raise money to do this, he didn't have the money to just do this on his own. He basically talked to every possible investor in Seattle. It was over 200 people, and 90% of those people rejected him, and he was only able to get a couple dozen people to invest, but it was just enough. And what he promised them was that he would grow this company. So it was all just about, hey, this is a growth investment. If you invest in me, your money's going to grow. It's all about growth. Okay, so in 1987, he's got his Il Giornale stores going, just a few of them, but he's in business. And the guys that owned Starbucks decided they didn't want to own it anymore. And so as far as, you know, someone purchasing it, Howard saw this as his opportunity because ultimately he was going to need his own roaster anyway. He was buying Starbucks coffee and selling that at Il Giornale, but he was getting big enough where he was going to need to actually have his own roaster. So he decided, okay, I need to buy Starbucks. Well, Starbucks was bigger than Il Giornale, and it had just been a year or two since he, you know, raised all this money, all this capital to get Il Giornale going. So he had to go back to his investors as well as some others investors and say, hey, we need to buy Starbucks now, and it's even more money than last time. Okay, so now he's got to, again, promise them growth. And so it's all about growth, growth, growth. Well, at the entrepreneurial spirit of Howard Schultz, he understood that you had to have high quality, flavorful coffee served by knowledgeable, friendly staff, and that's what the business was going to be built on. But what was pitched was growth. So it was all about growth, 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 right? Okay, so, and just to show you, he had some pretty good results. I mean, in '87, he started out with 17 stores, and he actually would add about 80% to his number of stores each year. So he had this nice J-curve going. So from 17 to about 17,000 21 years later, he had some pretty good growth. Okay, so now we come to 2006. Jim Donald, who was an employee of Starbucks, he got promoted up to be the CEO. All right, so now he sets a goal of 40,000 stores worldwide. And in 2006, they had about 14 or 15,000 stores. He basically wanted to almost triple the business again. Okay, so this is basically the legacy of Howard Schultz, is that people see, hey, this is about growth, and they kind of forgot about that whole thing about good customer service and high quality stuff. So this guy, Jim Donald, he pushes for store efficiency at the cost of good customer service. Starbucks foot traffic decreases, their stock price plummets like a rock, drops from almost $40 at the high point, and then it dips under $20 a share at the beginning of 2008. So now by 2008, the Great Recession is in full swing. Their stock price actually continued to slide, where it was under $8 a share by the end of the year. Okay, $4 cafe latte has become an unaffordable luxury to your average American, especially when you have strong competition now from McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, and other regional places like, around here we got Caribou and Dunn Brothers, and nationwide there's all kinds of espresso bars nowadays. And, it's no longer a blue ocean, really. So a great quote from Schultz is, we got swept up. We stopped asking, how can we do better? We had a sense of entitlement. So Howard Schultz decided at that point he needed to get back in charge. He retook the role of CEO, and he began to lead the company in a turnaround. So now that brings us to our Starbucks market conditions, and so now I will turn it over to Jason.
And thank you, Jack. We're going to walk into Starbucks market conditions. We're going to focus on three areas. The first being the coffee industry, followed by the market forces Starbucks faces, and finally the competitive environment. So a little bit about the coffee industry. Coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world, second only to crude oil, with 17 billion pounds of green coffee produced each year. 3 billion pounds of coffee is consumed in the United States annually, producing $19 billion market space in the United States. Gourmet coffee represents a $10 billion market space in the United States annually. And finally, coffee is the most popular beverage in the world, and Starbucks recognizes a 33% market share. So some market factors to take a look at. Economic conditions in the United States and certain international markets. The recent recession caused significant impact to Starbucks and their business strategy. Intense competition is not only good for consumers, but also challenges Starbucks to continually improve products and services. Increases in the cost of high-quality Arabica beans and other commodities have a significant impact on Starbucks' business strategy. Interruption in supply chain activities could affect Starbucks' ability to produce or deliver products. And finally, adverse public or medical opinions about the health effects of consuming Starbucks products can also have a significant impact on Starbucks' business strategy. So we move to Porter's 5 forces. My analysis concludes that there are two primary forces impacting Starbucks. The first is substitute products, where I focus on two areas. Drinks are the #1 opportunity for substitutes, where consumers have several choices, including sodas, various brands of energy drinks. Good old-fashioned water is generally free and the most healthy of all the choices. The second substitute product is focused on locations, as many lounge areas are now available in multiple retail locations. These areas allow consumers to congregate and socialize while enjoying a fresh cup of coffee or espresso. Starbucks is no longer the primary meeting location, as nearly all public locations offer free Wi-Fi and other convenient amenities to their guests. My analysis also identifies rivalries as a top force because of the many participants in the coffee industry. International brands include Tim Hortons in Canada, while national brands include Caribou Coffee, who's headquartered here in Minnesota, as well as local brands like the Royal Grounds, which is located on the Bethel campus. Each of these participants offers the same coffee consuming opportunities as Starbucks. And so we move into a SWOT analysis. We're going to take a look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So my research includes where I was able to identify critical components to the Starbucks strategy. Strengths include the Starbucks brand recognition, very loyal customers, excellent social reputation and social responsibility, and a very strong financial position. Weaknesses identified a few areas of concern, including overexpansion, with heavy reliability on a single brand and high operating costs. Opportunities include potential brand extension, additional growth in the worldwide coffee market, and product line extensions. And finally, threats. Threats include significant competition, the economy, including spendable income, and the continued focus on healthy lifestyles and healthy living initiatives. So in conclusion of the market factors identified when evaluating Starbucks' market strategy, it's critical to understand their mission statement that outlines their quest to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. The Starbucks brand is one of the most recognizable brands in the world. There's significant market strength in the Starbucks brand, and they enjoy some of the most loyal customers in any consumer market. Intense competition from competitors offering substantial substitute products from dozens of drink choices, sodas, very popular energy drinks, and healthy choices including fruit juices and water. Coffee, $19 billion industry with $10 billion focused on gourmet coffee alone. Starbucks enjoys a 33% market share and continues to seek additional growth. Thank you for viewing the market forces identified in Starbucks' business strategy. I'll now turn it over to Fred, who will walk through Starbucks' new strategy.
All right, thanks, Jason. I'm here to talk about Starbucks' new strategy. We're going to hit on the 7 big moves that Howard Schultz made, and we're going to talk about the alterations to the business model canvas in addition to the value proposition. So to start off, as Howard was preparing to take back the reins of Starbucks in January 2008, him and a number of his key business partners had some discussions and reflections that all resulted in the transformation agenda. The transformation agenda really accepted the fact that Starbucks had strayed from their original mission, that they could no longer stand for mediocrity, that the organization that was tangled in bureaucracy and solely focused on comp growth was no longer working. The key business leaders really needed to buy into this agenda and lead others through the change. And so it was important that this transformational agenda was sold to all the Starbucks partners. This really set Starbucks' reason to exist, which is the mission. The 7 big moves that Howard Schultz came up with were become the undisputed coffee authority, engage and inspire the Starbucks partners, ignite the emotional connection with the customers, expand Starbucks' global presence while making the store the heart of the local neighborhood, be an industry and global leader in ethical sourcing and environmental impact, create innovative growth platforms to carry Starbucks through the next couple of years, and deliver a sustainable and economic model. Now these 7 big moves can really be broken into a couple different pieces of the business model canvas. First off, 3 of the big moves really address Starbucks' value proposition. Being the undisputed coffee authority. This was something that Starbucks had started out with in the beginning, but they had lost their way a little bit over the last few years, prior to Howard Schultz coming back in 2008. The great coffee experience was in jeopardy just because of operational efficiency. As Starbucks had grown, they really started to outgrow the focus on coffee. Breakfast sandwiches had started to take over the stores. The re-steaming of large quantities of milk had deteriorated the quality of the drinks. And they needed to get back to providing the coffee that the masses truly wanted. In addition, they needed to expand Starbucks' global presence while making the stores the heart of the local community. Howard Schultz was very big on making Starbucks the 3rd place for people, right after their house, their home, and their work. In addition, they wanted to increase their international expansion into China. And they also wanted to make sure that they were more strategic on where they were putting stores, that they weren't just expanding for the sake of expanding, but were putting stores in places that truly made sense for the business. And lastly, they needed to create innovative growth platforms. That was key to carrying Starbucks through the next couple of years and really turning the company around. These 3 big moves really addressed the value proposition. Next, there were 2 of the moves were focusing on the key resources. Howard Schultz admits that Starbucks partners are key to the business, and engaging and inspiring those Starbucks partners is very important. They needed to maintain the benefits and investments that Starbucks was known to provide to all of their partners. They needed to retrain them to make sure that they were providing the high quality coffee that Starbucks was known for. And they needed to be honest with the situation and the partners' role in the new company going forward. Unfortunately, there were layoffs, and they needed to make sure that the partners were on board with this change. Also, one of the other key resources that they needed to address was the coffee bean. They needed to become an industry and global leader in ethical sourcing and the environmental impact. This was not only becoming a social demand at the time, but this also led for a better product at Starbucks by ensuring a consistently high quality coffee bean from farmers who truly took care of their land year after year. The last 2 pieces are customer relations and a blend between the value stream and cost structure. Customer relations. Starbucks needed to reignite the emotional connection with customers. Customers were key to the growth that Starbucks had experienced thus far, and then was going to be key to taking Starbucks into the next phase. They needed to remodel stores and add new equipment that allowed the barista to interact with the customer better. They needed to make sure that they were putting the right personnel back in place. As they were growing fast and focusing on their comp growth, they had a tendency to put people in place that weren't necessarily the right fit for Starbucks culture. And they also needed to went to seek feedback from the customer. They built online forums for customers to be able to relay information back to Starbucks. The last piece, and Howard Schultz admitted this was going to be the hardest piece, was delivering a sustainable economic platform. That without all the other changes, they really needed to make sure that they put in organizational clarity, a discipline to execute, and enthusiasm. They had enthusiasm that led to entitlement that needed to change. They needed to work for every piece going forward. So in conclusion, the new strategy really focused on changing 4 pieces of the business model canvas: the value proposition, key resources, customer relations, and a blend of the cost structure and the revenue stream. All of these changes led to a greater focus on Starbucks' mission at the time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit about some of the financials.
Thanks, Fred. Now it's time to move into the financials. I'm going to focus on breaking down the financials into before 2008, and then 2008-2009 when Howard Schultz became the CEO of Starbucks again, and then the results from 2010 to 2013 of Howard Schultz changes. Now basically before the transition, Starbucks was on a very aggressive growth strategy. They opened 2,500 new stores in 2007. 1,342 of these stores were owned by Starbucks, and this brought them to a total of 15,000 stores. 60% of those stores were owned by Starbucks, and 70% of those stores were in the United States, and 30% were international. From 2004 to 2007, Starbucks had an incredible 44% revenue growth, 42% operating income growth, and this brought them to $9.4 billion in revenue, of which $8 billion came from their own stores. However, there were some warning signs. Capital spending, which is basically debt, was rising rapidly. They had $1 billion in debt they were taking on in capital spending for opening all those stores. Working capital was dropping because they were carrying so much debt. And comparable store sales had dropped from 8% in 2005 to 5%. And this kind of means less new customers and less revenue coming in. And so their strategy summary in this period was an aggressive growth strategy. Matter of fact, very aggressive. And the shareholders were buying the stock for the growth, not the dividends. Now in January of 2008, Howard Schultz returned. Howard Schultz went right into a restructuring. He closed 600 stores, eliminated 1,000 positions, and took a charge against earnings for 2008-2009 that was approximately $600 million. The results were immediate. There was about $580 million in structural cost savings in 2008 alone. Growth stopped, and more licensed stores and were opened in less company-owned stores in the churning of the stores. Schultz saved cash. Free cash went up, working capital went up. They still had some other things that needed improvements, however, that were quite important. Comparable store sales had dropped 3% in 2008 and 5% in 2009. That's obviously a trend that's not good for a retail store. The net loss of Starbucks-owned stores was 371 in 2009 and 72 in 2010. So basically, their strategy was restructuring. Their growth in company stores stopped in 2009-2010. They focused on fixing the quality of stores and their products. And they had a cash increase, which was response to the strong economic headwinds of the recession that they were in at the time. In 2010, we started talking about the turnaround results. First of all, same-store sales went up 7%, up from a 5% decrease in 2009. Starbucks declared their first dividend of 23 cents in 2010, which really increased shareholder value and reason to hold the stock. New store growth was flat in 2010, but however in 2011 they made a change. They opened 500 new stores and they opened 400 more stores in 2012. Many of these stores were licensed instead of owned, and their mix of owned and licensed stores went to 52-48. Operating income was up, free cash flow, working capital, all were up. Their strategy was slower growth, but they were back to building new stores again. They returned $1.1 billion in shareholder value in 2010, 11, and 12. 2012, that represented a 38% payout of the revenue they were taking in. Same-store sales was up 7%, and then something we didn't touch on already, which is their growth in their specialty business. individual servings of coffee, instant coffee and other things, revenue from store sales, tea and bulk coffee, all were things that they were investing in at the time. So as we look at the financials, basically you could summarize their financials activities in three different ways. The first is they switched from an aggressive growth strategy to a manageable growth strategy. They changed their quality, and their comparable store sales went up, and their stores were finding new customers and new revenue again. And then shareholders, the story for shareholders is now you have dividends in addition to manageable growth. And that basically is the summary of the financials. I'm going to turn it over to Josh for the closing and a summary of transformational leadership.
Thanks, Dan. Starbucks is primarily a turnaround company, in my opinion, because of one thing: the transformational leadership of Howard Schultz. Remember how transformational leadership starts with the dice plus one mentality? Howard exemplifies this when he leads Starbucks to amazing growth. But it really becomes clear in 2008 when he returns. He speaks to the duality of wanting it all with Starbucks. It must be powerful and benevolent, respected and passionate, ubiquitous and imaginative. How does one accomplish this balancing act? Not only does he lead them back to a better place, as Dan just mentioned, but he sets the stage for sustainability and competitive advantage. Howard Schultz was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a truck driver, has a huge love for his company. He shows his dice plus one after returning to CEO when he says, "When I stood up in front of people and I apologized, I started crying in that first week." It's clear he deeply feels the pain of others and ultimately wants to work with others and for others, i.e. plus one of dice. He shows amazing emotional fortitude by saying, "We stood up in front of an entire company of leaders and almost made a confession that the leadership had failed 180,000 Starbucks people and their families." Wow. Being brought back as CEO, Schultz believed that they had stopped asking, "How can we do better?" He had to step into several roles at once to be a change agent inside the company, a direction setter to the outside world. How did he do it? By casting visions, motivating, and aligning responsibilities in each of these roles. When questioned on his strategy, he states, "The challenge was how to preserve and enhance the integrity of the only assets we have as a company, our values, our culture and guiding principles, and the reservoir of trust we have with our people." How does Schultz do this? Well, he uses his intellectual flexibility and dynamic determination, and for an evening in 2008, closes all U.S. stores, 7,100, to motivate and realign his employees, or partners, as he refers to them. He says, "We're retraining our people because we have forgotten what we stand for, and that's the pursuit of unequivocal, absolute commitment to quality could remind people of our character and values, and we could make a difference." Having the dice plus one qualities and the ability to dynamically bounce between the roles and responsibilities isn't the entire story. One of the R of the 4R model, which seems the most obvious, yet doesn't always get the attention it deserves, is results. How do you get results and sustain them? Schultz says we reinvested in our people, we reinvested in innovation, and we reinvested in the values of our company. That reinvestment is really the key to results. Having the ability, as Jason pointed out, to meet all five forces and the determination to drive them forward will sustain them. Starbucks took $700 million of costs out of its operations in 2 years, and they're looking to cut costs more. Increasing customer value and brand loyalty while decreasing costs almost verges on the blue ocean effect. Primarily, though, their competitive advantage comes from Schultz himself as the driver. Setting up a company culture is described in this quote: "The only way we can succeed and sustain growth and innovation is linked to the basic elements of one cup of coffee, one customer, and one barista at a time." Starbucks, having this level 5 type of leader, positions them to strategically take advantage of their wide variety of resources. And like Schultz says himself, "I learned there wasn't going to be one silver bullet that was going to save us. There had to be a comprehensive transformation from the bottom up." So the story of a successful turnaround involves several items. One, starting with Jack telling us the history of how Starbucks came to be and how they have 40 plus years of experiences. Jason spoke about Starbucks' brand of recognition, intense competition, and a $19 billion coffee industry, which shows great market conditions. Fred's analysis of their value proposition, new strategy, highlighting their 7 big moves, starting with the first as being the undisputed coffee authority. Dan's review of their financial execution and strategies, moving from an aggressive growth to a more sustainable growth, and focusing on quality and respecting its shareholders. And finally, the key piece of implementing a turnaround strategy is the transformational leadership qualities of Howard Schultz, driving the company forward. Starbucks has implemented many strategic initiatives to reintroduce its competitive advantage back into the marketplace and make it sustainable. Let me leave you with Schultz's drink, a doppio espresso macchiato, a double espresso topped with steamed milk. What's yours?